Hello, my name is Jason Kranick, Vice President of Business Transformation and Innovation with Fluor Corporation. And with respect to our operational definition of innovation, for Fluor, it's about what ideas, what solutions are out there that actually make us more competitive, that make us execute our work more efficiently, that brings value to our clients, something that gets noticed by our clients, but also something that our employees can rally around so that they can quickly adopt and implement it on their projects.
My name is Erin Grossi. I am the Chief Economist for UL, and also I oversee our corporate innovation work. And innovation in a general sense, I think just infers that we're looking to make real tangible improvements to the business, improving the customer experience, improving our bottom line, improving the quality of our products, improving the employee experience and how we work. Any of those things is in order, and we really need to hold innovation to that standard. It's not enough to say we're doing things differently. We need to be able to say we're moving the needle in any of these regards.
Hi, I'm David Williamson. I'm the Vice President for New Product Development at the Educational Testing Service. And my operational definition of innovation stems from a generalized definition, in that anytime we're making purposeful change for a business reason, we're innovating towards some result. How we operationally define that depends upon the kind of business purpose we're trying to achieve. And there can be many different kinds of operational definitions of what innovation is based upon the business goals we have and why we're making change. So the measures themselves are going to stem from the goals we have and what kind of changes we're trying to institute.
My name is Jim Steichleather. I am the Chief Innovation Officer for Dell. It's an interesting job, not what you expect. I'm not responsible for innovating Dell's products and services, but to help Dell itself to be a more innovative company. Now, one of the problems that we initially encountered when the group was formed up is defining exactly what innovation is. One of the things we learned is that it was a much more difficult proposition than we were anticipating. After interviewing a lot of people, executives, managers, technicians, both inside of Dell and with our customers, the answer basically became, well, I know it when I see it. So one of the first things we undertook was to try and get an explanation of what innovation really is. And we began to looking at it in terms of what it wasn't. One of the first things we discovered is innovation is not invention. Invention, or R&D, is a process of taking capital and effort and turning it into intellectual property or knowledge. Innovation is the inverse of that, taking that same intellectual property and knowledge and turning it back into capital by creating some type of value proposition with it. The next problem that we ran into is people always think of innovation in terms of products and services. What we learned as we studied innovation is some of the most sophisticated and valuable innovations are actually new business models, or new operating models, or new management models, and new organizational models. So the scope of innovation went way beyond technology and actually looked at the organization as a whole. And the last thing we kind of discovered is what are the attributes of innovation? Because again, people still thought of it in terms of that's innovative, that's not innovative, but really couldn't describe what the difference was. So one of the things that we realize is, first off, an innovation is generally associated with a forward-thinking idea, either anticipating a problem in the future or anticipating future technologies and constructing value propositions around that. The second thing that we learned is that in many cases, an innovation actually requires a new idea. It may not be a new idea. It may be an idea in one domain, such as healthcare, that can be picked up and applied in another domain, such as finance. The other thing that we learned, especially in dealing with our technicians, is a lot of times an innovation is not necessarily feasible. It's a great idea, but you really can't do it. So feasibility became one of the attributes we associated with innovation. We also realized that many times you had a feasible idea. In fact, engineers can generally do anything once, but something actually had to be viable to be an innovation. You had to be able to do it over and over again. And lastly, and sometimes often missed, is an innovation is valuable. Somebody is willing to exchange value for the innovation. So when we bundle up all of those ideas together, it fast became our operational definition of what innovation is.
So our main barriers with respect to innovation and actually getting it institutionalized in the company is really the communication and adoption. So we're very good at ideation. We're very good at actually defining what needs to happen. But when it comes to implementing these solutions on multiple projects, that's our biggest challenge. That's where we put our focus, is making sure that the people that are adopting these solutions understand why it's important for them, how it's going to make an improvement to their project execution, and ultimately bring value to our clients.
I think the key barrier to innovation, when you really boil it down to its essence, is fear. An innovator is it's steeped in dualities, so it's natural for us to understand that what feels uncomfortable is actually going to lead to a greater sense of stability, or that what seems very risky in one moment is actually very wise considering all the threats that are around you at any given time. So, for us that feels very natural, but I think for business people who are managing the P&L, that can be incredibly difficult to digest and make decisions around.
There are many barriers to innovation, both within individual companies and the general field, but for established organizations, the biggest barrier to innovation is that there's a reason they're so successful in their industry. They're successful because they have a history of doing things well, of succeeding in their marketplace, and of delivering products that people want and appreciate. And so whenever you think about making changes, you have a lot that you built up that is successful and that works. And so there's a fundamental investment in making sure those continue to work. So positioning yourself for change as an established organization is a difficult proposition, because you're essentially forecasting that you want to move from a current state that might be succeeding quite well to a future state where you might be able to do better, but where there's some risk that you could undermine some aspects of your current success.
One of the major impediments to innovation actually is derived from people's understanding of what it is. Oftentimes, innovation is actually looked at as a project or a program within an organization, as opposed to really being a state of mind, a way of thinking about new products and services and customers and designs. It also sometimes gets confused with being a set of metrics as opposed to being actually a cultural attribute. So when we work with our customers and we work internally, oftentimes the biggest barrier to innovation is this idea that it can be totally proceduralized, that it can be done in a cookie cutter or in a traditionally managed way, as opposed to actually creating a culture from within which innovation can emerge.
It's certainly important to track our innovation success in terms of quantitative measures. I think that we do a pretty good job of measuring basic inputs and outputs. So how much are we spending on R&D or capital, and how much is that translating into new products and services and our revenue on the backside.
A key element of knowing whether you're successful in your innovation is having some understanding of what success looks like. One of the ways we can do this is with various kinds of metrics. But there's a certain catch to the metrics we might use for tracking innovation. We want to make sure the metrics we're using are consistent with the real goals we have for innovation, because sometimes the things that are easy to measure aren't necessarily the things that you really want out of your innovation. And so the key part is making sure that the metrics you use and the measures you have for whether your innovations are working really do represent the true part of what you want, or whether they represent convenient proxies. And if they're convenient proxies, then you run the risk of organizing the organization and motivating the organization to do things that aren't truly meaningful for the kind of innovation you really want to have.
One of the big issues that we are always encountering with innovation is, what is its value? What does it give back to the corporation? What is it giving back to the enterprise? And there's really a couple of ways to look at that. First off, innovation is actually a long-term strategic process. It is creating a culture that innovation can come out of. And oftentimes you can't directly attach a particular activity of my group or another group or even a function within the organization and the innovations that come out, because innovations actually emerge more than they're directly created. But at the same time, there is a need to actually quantify what you've done. So one of the things we've started looking at is, how can we tie the innovation activities of the organization, for example, to our net promoter scores, our customer views of the company. We're beginning to look for more and more external validation. Are you listed as among the top 100 innovative companies? When you're interviewing people for jobs, do they think of us in terms of being an innovative company? And that really is the key indicator to us of whether we're successful or not. Not necessarily the ROI or the RONA or the IRR, because those will come if you're innovative. It is the ongoing measures of, are we perceived as being innovators by our employees, by our customers, and by the world as a whole.
The metrics that we are missing the most for innovation are more composite metrics, I believe. So the fact that we've realized that given all the systemic challenges that things like the Internet of Things present to us, for instance, we're going to need to innovate in networks and consortia much more often. So I think being able to measure the amount that goes into developing those networks vis-a-vis the network effects would be the next kind of generation of quantitative measurement that we'd like to see achieved.
For different kinds of innovation, there's different kinds of measures. And one of the questions is, what are the kind of measures that we might want to have that we don't currently have? It depends entirely on the kind of innovation we want to achieve. Many kinds of innovations are relatively easy to get some kind of measure of. These are things that are usually highly empirical in the first place. Things like increased profit, increased revenue, increased satisfaction from the surveys for employee engagement, things like this. But there are other kinds of innovation that are much more difficult to measure and therefore to understand whether we're doing well in or not. These are things that have to do with fundamental, game-changing kinds of innovations. What kinds of things are we doing at the fundamental level that might be more long-term than short-term, that might have a long-term payoff rather than a short-term payoff? How do we know if we're making progress on trying to make the fundamental change in an organization so that we can have revolutionary changes rather than incremental changes that are easy to measure? Those are the kinds of metrics that we really need and that there aren't many of for us to understand whether we're being successful or not in building that kind of an environment in our organization.
You know, when you're thinking about how do you measure innovation, or even metrics in general, there are really three reasons that you're doing it. One reason is to report. What is it that I've done? Another reason is to monitor what's going on to see whether you need to make changes or corrections. And the third reason is giving you some kind of visibility into the future. What we're doing now is going to result in something in the future. While we're always working to develop new metrics and new ways of achieving those three objectives, one issue we keep running into on a regular basis. And it's the issue of how do you measure the intangibles? You know, one of the things that we talk about in innovation is most innovation is actually the product of failure. Try something, fail, learn, try something, fail, learn, until eventually you're accomplishing what you were trying to accomplish and you're successful. You know, it's the classic story of the 20 years that resulted in the overnight success. The biggest issue we have right now is how do you measure that learning? How do you measure the new capabilities into the organization? Because they're intangible and they don't manifest themselves onto the balance sheet or the income statement until they finally succeed. To me, if we can ever come up with a way of measuring or at least predicting that, then we'll have a home run.